My name is Derek Mitchell. And the moment the CIA agent stepped through my door, he didn't flash a badge or raise his voice. He simply placed a photograph on my kitchen table, one I had found 3 days earlier in my grandfather's attic, and asked in a tone that made my blood run cold, "Do you understand what you've stumbled into?" It wasn't the federal investigation that terrified me. It wasn't even the classified stamps on documents I had barely begun to read. It was the quiet certainty in his voice, the certainty that my grandfather, the man who taught me to fish and told stories about fixing Jeeps in Korea, had lived an entire life I knew nothing about. That was the moment I realized the people who raised me weren't just keeping secrets. They were protecting something so dangerous that uncovering it could unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, and they were willing to destroy me to keep it buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The September morning arrived with that particular kind of stillness that only exists in small Oregon towns, where mist clings to the pine trees and the air smells like damp earth and memory. I woke at dawn in my grandfather's house on Maple Street, the old craftsman creaking around me like it was adjusting to his absence. 6 months had passed since Frank Mitchell died, and the family had finally decided it was time to clear out his things. They chose me for the task, not out of love or trust, but because I was the one they considered expendable enough to spend weeks sorting through a dead man's belongings. My mother had handed me the keys with that practiced smile she wore whenever she needed something from me, but didn't want to acknowledge it directly. "Your grandfather would have wanted you to do this. You always had patience for his stories." The words were kind, but they carried the familiar weight of expectation. I was being given a job no one else wanted, dressed up as an honor. My brother Brandon had been too busy with his finance career in Seattle. Uncle Robert had important cases that couldn't wait. So it fell to me, the youngest, the one working a modest job at the Portland Public Library, the one whose time was considered less valuable than everyone else's. I moved through the main floor of the house, past the worn leather chair where Grandpa Frank used to sit with his evening newspaper, past the kitchen table where he taught me to play chess on rainy afternoons. Photographs lined the hallway, moments frozen in time. Frank in his army uniform, young and serious. Frank with my grandmother on their wedding day. Frank holding me as a baby, his weathered hands steady and sure. Each image felt like a door I could no longer open, questions I could no longer ask. The attic stairs folded down from the ceiling with a groan of old hinges. Dust motes swirled in the shaft of morning light that followed me up into the cramped space beneath the rafters. The attic stretched longer than I expected, filled with the accumulated debris of a life fully lived. Boxes stacked against boxes. Old furniture draped in sheets like ghosts waiting to be acknowledged. A rack of clothes that still carried the faint scent of mothballs and Old Spice. I stood there for a moment, overwhelmed by the task, by the weight of sorting through someone's entire existence and deciding what mattered enough to keep. I started with the boxes nearest the stairs, working methodically. Old tax returns and receipts. Christmas decorations wrapped in tissue paper. Books with cracked spines and inscriptions from people long gone. I found a box of letters my grandmother had written to Frank during the war, tied with string, each envelope addressed in her careful script. Reading even one felt like trespassing, so I set them aside to bring to my mother. Hours passed. The attic grew warmer as the sun climbed higher. I was reaching for another box when I noticed the old military footlocker shoved far back beneath the eaves, half hidden behind a dresser. The olive green paint had faded and chipped, and stenciled on the front in white letters was my grandfather's name and service number. I dragged it out into the open space, the metal scraping against the wooden floor. The lock had rusted, but it wasn't fastened. I lifted the heavy lid and found exactly what I expected at first glance. Uniforms folded with military precision. A battered helmet. Dog tags on a beaded chain. Medals in a small wooden box, each one representing something Frank had never talked about in detail. I lifted the uniforms carefully, respecting the weight of what they meant, and that's when I felt it. The bottom of the footlocker sat higher than it should, given the depth of the container. My heart kicked against my ribs. I pressed down on the base and it shifted slightly. I ran my fingers along the edges until I found a small indentation, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I pried it up, and the false bottom lifted free, revealing a space about 3 inches deep. Inside lay a waterproof envelope, the kind designed to survive floods and fires, marked with a series of numbers written in black ink. No words, just numbers that meant nothing to me. I opened the envelope with hands that had started trembling without my permission. Inside were documents, dozens of them, some typed on old paper that had yellowed with age, others printed more recently. Photographs spilled out, black and white images of men in suits standing in front of buildings I didn't recognize. Maps marked with coordinates and notations in my grandfather's handwriting. And then I saw the stamps. Classified. Top secret. Eyes only. Some of the documents had been partially redacted, black bars obscuring names and locations, but enough remained visible to make my stomach drop. There were reports written in dense military language about operations I had never heard of, intelligence assessments about foreign nationals, surveillance photographs dated from the 1950s and 60s, and woven through everything, appearing again and again, was my grandfather's signature, authorizing actions, confirming receipt of classified information, acknowledging participation in operations that supposedly ended before I was born. One folder contained correspondence between Frank Mitchell and someone identified only as Clearwater. The letters discussed assets, handlers, and something called Project Canary. Another set of documents detailed payments made to offshore accounts, transactions that continued for decades, the most recent dated just 2 years before my grandfather died. I spread everything across the attic floor, trying to make sense of the pieces, and slowly a picture began forming that I didn't want to see. Frank Mitchell hadn't just been a soldier. He had been intelligence, maybe CIA, maybe something else entirely. And whatever he had done, whatever he had been, part of it hadn't ended when the war did. It had continued quietly beneath the surface of his ordinary life in Riverside, Oregon, where he fixed cars and went to church and pretended to be nothing more than a retired veteran with a vegetable garden. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything, working quickly, feeling exposed even though I was alone. Some instinct told me these documents needed to be documented before they could disappear. When I finished, I carefully replaced everything in the envelope, put it back in the false bottom, and lowered the lid of the footlocker. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down on an old trunk and focus on breathing. The logical part of my brain said I should tell someone. My mother. Uncle Robert. The authorities. But another part, the part that had learned early how my family worked, knew exactly what would happen. They would take the documents. They would tell me I misunderstood. They would close ranks and handle it quietly, the way they handled everything that threatened the careful image we presented to the world. And I would be pushed aside again, told I was overreacting again, made to feel foolish for thinking I deserved answers. I climbed down from the attic and called the one person I knew would listen without judgment. Nicole Harper answered on the second ring, her voice bright and curious. She had been my closest friend since college, one of the few people who saw me clearly and never asked me to be smaller to make others comfortable. When I told her I needed to talk about something I'd found, she heard the tension in my voice and told me she'd be at my apartment in an hour. I locked up the house and drove back to Portland in a daze, the city rising up around me as I crossed the river, the afternoon light turning everything golden. My studio apartment felt too small when I walked in, the walls pressing close. I paced until Nicole knocked, and when I opened the door, the relief of seeing her familiar face nearly undid me. She stepped inside, taking in my expression, and immediately asked what happened. I showed her the photographs on my phone, watching her eyes widen as she scrolled through image after image. Nicole worked as an investigative journalist for a local independent outlet, and she had the kind of mind that could see patterns where others saw chaos. She zoomed in on the classified stamps, on the signatures, on the dates that didn't align with the story our family had always told. "This is real," she said quietly, looking up at me. "Your grandfather was involved in something significant. These documents, Derek, if they're authentic, they're evidence of operations that were never disclosed. Some of these dates coincide with events that were controversial even then. If this comes out, it's not just your family history that gets rewritten." I sank onto the couch, the weight of it settling over me. "What do I do?" She considered for a moment, her journalist instincts warring with her loyalty to me. "You need to secure the originals. Make copies." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And then you need to decide if you're ready for what happens when you start asking questions, because once you do, you can't take it back. I spent that evening making copies of everything, scanning documents, uploading files to secure cloud storage, preparing for the possibility that the originals might vanish. Nicole stayed with me, ordering food neither of us ate, helping me organize the information into something coherent. By the time she left, the sun had set, and my apartment felt like a bunker, a place I was fortifying against an enemy I couldn't yet see. The next morning I called my mother. I kept my voice steady, casual, as I told her I had found some interesting things in the attic and wanted to talk to the family about them. There was a pause just a beat too long before she asked what kind of things. Old documents, I said. Military records. She told me to bring them to Sunday dinner. The whole family would be there. We could look at them together. Sunday dinner at the Mitchell house was a tradition that felt more like an obligation, a performance of family unity that required everyone to play their assigned roles. My mother cooked too much food. Uncle Robert dominated conversation with stories about his legal victories. Brandon checked his phone and made comments about market trends. And I sat quietly, the dependable youngest, expected to listen and agree and never challenge the established order. But this Sunday, I arrived with a folder containing copies of some of the documents, the least inflammatory ones, enough to open the conversation without detonating it completely. I waited until we had finished eating, until the dishes were cleared and everyone had settled into the living room with coffee. Then I placed the folder on the coffee table and said I had found something in Grandpa's attic that I didn't understand. Uncle Robert reached for the folder before I finished speaking. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first page, and his entire demeanor shifted. His jaw tightened. His fingers gripped the paper harder than necessary. "Where did you get these?" he asked, and the question sounded more like an accusation. I told him. From the footlocker in the attic. There were more, hidden in a false bottom. My mother's face went pale. Brandon leaned forward, curious now, asking what the big deal was. Uncle Robert closed the folder and looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between fury and fear. "These are private family matters, Derek. They're not your concern. You need to return all of these documents to me immediately." The dismissal was so absolute, so reflexive, that something inside me snapped. I met his eyes and said I wanted to understand what Grandpa was involved in. I deserved to know the truth about my own family. Robert's voice dropped to a tone that made the room feel smaller. "You don't know what you're talking about. These documents are classified. You've committed a federal crime just by possessing them. If you know what's good for you, you'll hand them over and forget you ever saw them." My mother reached out, her hand hovering near my arm but not quite touching, her voice taking on that pleading quality she used when she wanted to smooth things over. "Derek, sweetheart, your uncle is right. This isn't something you need to worry about. Let us handle it. We'll make sure everything is taken care of properly." Brandon added his voice, telling me I was being dramatic, making something out of nothing, and couldn't I just let it go for once? I looked around the room at the three of them, at the unified front they had formed in less than a minute, and I realized this wasn't surprise I was seeing. This was damage control. They had known. Maybe not all the details, maybe not everything, but they had known Frank Mitchell's life contained secrets, and they had agreed, collectively, to keep me in the dark. I stood up, my voice steady despite the anger rising in my chest. "I'm not giving you the documents. Not until I understand what they mean. Not until someone tells me the truth." Uncle Robert rose as well, his lawyer instincts taking over, his voice turning cold and clinical. "Then you're making a serious mistake. Those documents don't belong to you. Legally, as executor of Frank's estate, they belong to me. If you don't return them, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. And believe me, Derek, you don't want to go down that road." I left my mother's house with the folder still in my hands, their voices following me out the door, each one calling after me with a different flavor of desperation. My mother pleaded for me to be reasonable. Brandon told me I was being childish. Uncle Robert stood on the porch, his silhouette framed by the yellow light spilling from inside, and he didn't say anything at all. His silence felt more threatening than any words could have been. I drove back to Portland with my heart hammering, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached, and for the first time in my life, I felt the strange exhilaration of choosing myself over their comfort. The days that followed had a surreal quality, as if I had stepped through some invisible barrier into a version of reality that operated by different rules. I went to work at the Portland Public Library, shelving books and helping patrons find references, moving through the familiar routines while my mind spun through everything I had discovered. The documents sat in a locked drawer in my apartment, but they might as well have been burning a hole through the floor. I couldn't stop thinking about them, couldn't stop seeing my grandfather's signature on papers that described operations with names like Nightfall and Broken Arrow. Nicole called me every evening, checking in, asking if I was all right. She had started doing her own research, pulling records from public databases, cross-referencing dates and locations. What she found made the picture even more complicated. Some of the operations mentioned in Frank's documents corresponded to known CIA activities from the Cold War era, missions that had been partially declassified decades later. But others had no public record at all, as if they had been erased from history or had never officially existed in the first place. On Wednesday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We need to talk about this situation before it gets out of hand. Please come to dinner Friday. Just you and me. No Robert, no Brandon." I stared at the message for a long time, knowing it was a trap of sorts, but also recognizing the olive branch for what it was. My mother had always been the mediator, the one who tried to keep peace even when peace required someone to sacrifice their needs. I texted back that I would come, but I wasn't bringing the documents. Friday evening arrived with rain, the kind of steady Pacific Northwest downpour that turns the world gray and soft. I drove to Riverside, windshield wipers beating a rhythm that matched my anxiety, and pulled up to my childhood home just as the streetlights flickered on. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her face drawn with worry, and ushered me inside with an urgency that made me wary. The house smelled like pot roast, comfort food designed to soften resistance. She had set the table for two, candles lit, everything arranged to create an atmosphere of intimacy and trust. We sat down and she served the food with hands that trembled slightly, and I realized she was genuinely frightened. Not of me, but of something larger, something she had been carrying alone. We ate in silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke. "Your grandfather made me promise never to talk about certain parts of his life. He said it was for our protection, that some things were better left buried." I thought he was being dramatic, you know how he could be, always with his military stories and his sense of duty. But after he died, Robert found some papers in Frank's safe deposit box, and that's when I understood he hadn't been exaggerating. I set down my fork, my appetite gone. "What kind of papers?" She looked away, focusing on something beyond the window where rain streaked down the glass. Letters from government officials. Agreements signed under classifications I didn't understand. Instructions for what to do if certain people ever came asking questions. Robert told me we needed to control the information to protect the family from blowback. He said if Frank's activities became public, it could destroy all of us. The word destroy hung in the air between us, heavy and deliberate. I leaned forward, keeping my voice gentle but firm. "Mom, I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I just want to understand what Grandpa was involved in. Don't I have a right to know the truth about my own family?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she reached across the table to grasp my hand. "Of course you do, sweetheart. But you have to understand, this isn't just about truth. This is about survival. Your uncle has already made calls. He has connections, people who can make problems disappear. If you push this, if you take those documents to the wrong people, he will protect the family by any means necessary." The threat was clear, even wrapped in maternal concern. I pulled my hand back slowly, feeling the distance between us widen into something that might never close. "Are you telling me Uncle Robert would hurt me?" She shook her head quickly, desperately. No, nothing like that. But he could make your life very difficult. Legal troubles, employment issues, things that seem coincidental but aren't. He's done it before, Derek. To people outside the family who knew too much. I sat back in my chair, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "How long have you known he does things like that?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. The pot roast congealed on our plates. The candles burned lower. And I realized my mother had invited me here not to reconcile, but to deliver a warning dressed as love. She wanted me to understand the cost of defiance, to scare me back into compliance before Robert took more direct action. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go." She rose as well, panic flashing across her face. Derek, please. Just give Robert the documents. Tell him you made copies but you'll destroy them. We can make this go away. We can go back to how things were. I looked at her, this woman who had raised me, who had taught me to be kind and thoughtful and considerate of others, and I saw clearly for the first time that she had also taught me to disappear when my presence became inconvenient. I can't go back, I said quietly. I don't think I want to anymore. I walked out into the rain and she didn't follow. The weekend passed in a haze of indecision and anxiety. I knew I was standing at a crossroads, and every path forward led somewhere I couldn't fully see. I could give in, hand over the documents, accept whatever sanitized version of the truth my family decided to feed me. I could ignore the whole thing, put the footlocker back in the attic and pretend I had never looked inside. Or I could do what every instinct told me was dangerous but necessary. I could take the documents to someone outside the family, someone with the authority and obligation to investigate. Nicole came over on Sunday morning with coffee and bagels and a determined expression. She sat across from me at my small kitchen table and pulled out her laptop. I've been thinking about your options. If you want answers, real answers, you need to contact the authorities. Not local police. They won't have jurisdiction over classified materials. You need to reach out to the federal government directly. The idea terrified me, but she was right. I had spent days agonizing over what to do, paralyzed by the weight of the decision, but the truth was there had only ever been one real choice. I couldn't unknow what I had learned. I couldn't unsee my grandfather's name on documents that described operations in countries we weren't officially operating in. And I couldn't trust my family to tell me anything but the version of the story that protected their interests. Nicole helped me draft an email to the FBI's field office in Portland, carefully worded, explaining that I had discovered classified documents belonging to my deceased grandfather and wanted guidance on how to proceed legally. We sent it late Sunday afternoon. And then there was nothing to do but wait. I tried to distract myself with work, with books, with anything that would stop my mind from spinning through worst-case scenarios, but the waiting stretched every hour into an eternity. Monday passed with no response. Tuesday morning I woke to find 3 missed calls from Uncle Robert, and a voicemail that made my blood run cold. His voice was calm, measured, the tone he used in courtrooms when he was about to dismantle someone's credibility. Derek, I know you've been asking questions about your grandfather's service. I want you to understand something very clearly. Frank Mitchell was a patriot who served his country with distinction. The documents you found are classified for reasons that have nothing to do with wrongdoing and everything to do with national security. If you take this outside the family, if you contact federal authorities, you will be opening an investigation that will hurt a lot of innocent people, people who trusted your grandfather, people who are still alive and deserve their privacy. I'm asking you as your uncle to think very carefully about the consequences before you do something you can't take back. The message ended with a soft click, but the implication echoed in my empty apartment. He knew. Somehow Robert knew I was considering going to the authorities, which meant he was either monitoring me or had contacts who were. The realization that I was being watched made my skin crawl. I checked my apartment for anything unusual, cameras or listening devices, feeling paranoid and ridiculous, but unable to shake the sensation of invisible eyes. Wednesday afternoon, my work phone rang at the library. The voice on the other end was polite and professional, identifying itself as calling from the Portland FBI field office. They had received my email and would like to schedule a meeting to discuss the materials I had referenced. Could I come in Thursday at 10 in the morning? I agreed, my voice steadier than I felt, and wrote down the address they provided. That evening, Nicole insisted on coming with me to the meeting. You're not doing this alone. Whatever happens, you need someone there who has your back. I was grateful beyond words. The idea of walking into a federal building by myself, carrying documents that had already torn my family apart, felt overwhelming. With Nicole beside me, it felt possible. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear, the rain finally gone, the city washed clean and gleaming in autumn light. Nicole picked me up at 9, and we drove downtown in tense silence, both of us understanding that whatever happened in the next few hours would change everything. The federal building was all glass and steel, imposing in its bureaucratic authority, and security was tight. We passed through metal detectors, showed identification, and were escorted to a conference room on the 5th floor. Two agents waited for us, a man and a woman, both dressed in dark suits that seemed designed to project competence without personality. They introduced themselves as Agent Wilson and Agent Torres, thanked us for coming, and gestured for us to sit. The room was windowless, the walls a neutral beige, the table a cheap laminate surface that had seen countless interrogations and interviews. A recorder sat in the center, its small red light already glowing. Agent Wilson folded his hands on the table and looked at me with eyes that revealed nothing. "Mr. Mitchell, you indicated in your email that you found classified documents belonging to your grandfather, Frank Mitchell. Before we proceed, I need to make sure you understand the seriousness of possessing classified materials without proper clearance." I nodded, my throat dry. "I understand. I didn't go looking for them. I was cleaning out his attic after he passed away, and I found a false compartment in his old military footlocker." Agent Torres made notes on a yellow legal pad. "And what exactly did you find?" I pulled out the folder containing copies of some of the documents and slid it across the table. "These are copies. The originals are still at my grandfather's house, secured in the footlocker. I made copies because I wanted to protect the evidence in case something happened to the originals." Wilson opened the folder and began examining the contents, his expression unreadable. Torres leaned forward to look as well, and I watched their faces carefully, trying to gauge their reaction. After several minutes of silence, Wilson looked up at me. "Mr. Mitchell, where did you say your grandfather served?" "Korea," I answered. "He was in the army during the Korean War. That's what he always told us." Wilson exchanged a glance with Torres, some unspoken communication passing between them. "And after his service ended, what did he do for a living?" "He worked as a mechanic in Riverside, Oregon. Fixed cars, ran a small garage. He retired about 15 years ago." Wilson tapped one of the documents, a report dated 1967, years after the Korean War had ended. "These documents suggest your grandfather remained active in intelligence operations well beyond his official military service. Some of these operations were conducted under what we call unofficial cover, meaning he would have appeared to be a civilian while actually working for a government agency." "Did he ever mention anything like that?" I shook my head. "Never. He told stories about Korea, about fixing jeeps and keeping supply lines running. But he never said anything about intelligence work or operations in other countries." Torres spoke for the first time, her voice softer than Wilson's but no less direct. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you something important, and I need you to be completely honest. Has anyone else seen these documents? Have you shown them to family members or friends?" I hesitated, knowing the answer would complicate things. "I showed copies to my family last Sunday. My mother, my uncle Robert, and my brother Brandon. My uncle is an attorney, and he told me the documents were classified and that I should give them to him immediately. He also threatened legal action if I didn't comply." Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly. "He threatened you?" I nodded. "He said as executor of my grandfather's estate, the documents legally belonged to him. He told me I had committed a federal crime by possessing them, and that if I didn't turn them over, he would take legal action against me." Wilson sat back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "And how did your uncle know these documents were classified? Had he seen similar materials before?" "That's what I've been wondering. My mother said that after my grandfather died, my uncle found some papers in a safe deposit box. She implied that Robert knew about my grandfather's classified work before I found anything in the attic." Torres stopped writing and looked at Wilson again, that silent communication happening once more. Wilson turned his attention back to me. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to be direct with you. Based on what you've shown us, your grandfather was likely involved in intelligence operations that remain classified. Some of these documents reference programs that have never been publicly acknowledged. The fact that your uncle knew about this work and attempted to retrieve the documents before we became involved is concerning. It suggests he may have been aware of ongoing security issues related to your grandfather's activities." The weight of what he was saying settled over me like a physical thing. "Are you telling me my uncle is involved in whatever my grandfather was doing?" Wilson chose his words carefully. "I'm telling you that we need to investigate further. We'll need to take custody of the original documents. We'll also need to interview your family members, starting with your uncle. And Mr. Mitchell, I need you to understand that from this moment forward, you may be in danger. If your grandfather's work involves sensitive operations, and if there are people who want to keep that work hidden, your decision to come forward may have made you a target. The room suddenly felt colder. Nicole's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tight. Wilson continued, his tone gentler now. We're going to provide you with a contact number. If anything unusual happens, if you feel threatened or unsafe, you call immediately. Don't try to handle this on your own. Don't confront your family members. Just call us. Do you understand? I nodded, not trusting my voice. Torres closed her notepad and stood. We're going to need you to take us to your grandfather's house so we can secure the original documents. We'll also need you to provide us with any other information you have about your grandfather's life. His contacts, places he traveled, anything that might help us understand the scope of his activities. Can you do that? Yes, I said. I can do that. We left the federal building with 2 agents following us in an unmarked sedan, and the normalcy of the morning traffic felt surreal against the enormity of what was unfolding. Nicole drove us back to Riverside, neither of us speaking much, both of us processing the fact that my family's secrets had just become a federal investigation. When we pulled up to Frank Mitchell's house on Maple Street, the place looked exactly as I had left it, quiet and ordinary, giving no hint of the storm it contained. Agent Wilson and Agent Torres followed me inside and up to the attic. I showed them the footlocker, the false bottom, the waterproof envelope with its numbered markings. Wilson pulled on latex gloves before removing the documents, handling each page with the kind of care that confirmed their significance. Torres photographed everything, documenting the scene as if it were a crime scene, which perhaps it was. They spent nearly 2 hours going through the attic, searching for additional hidden compartments, checking inside old boxes and beneath floorboards. They found 2 more envelopes, these ones hidden inside hollowed-out books on a shelf I hadn't examined closely. More documents, more photographs, more evidence of a life lived in shadows. When they finished, they sealed everything in evidence bags and loaded it into their vehicle. Wilson turned to me before they left, his expression serious. Mr. Mitchell, you did the right thing by coming to us. I know this isn't easy, exposing your family's secrets. But if your grandfather was involved in illegal activities, or if classified information has been compromised, we need to know. The investigation will take time, possibly months. During that period, I need you to maintain your normal routine as much as possible. Don't discuss this case with anyone outside of law enforcement. And remember what I said about safety. If you feel threatened, call immediately. I watched them drive away, taking with them the physical evidence of my grandfather's double life, and I felt strangely empty. Nicole stood beside me on the porch, her arm around my shoulders. You okay? She asked. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know what I expected to feel, but it wasn't this. She guided me back to her car. Let's get out of here. You can stay at my place tonight. You shouldn't be alone. We drove back to Portland as the afternoon light faded, and I watched Riverside disappear in the rearview mirror, the small town where I had grown up, where my grandfather had lived his cover story so convincingly that even his own family had believed it. Somewhere in that town, Uncle Robert was probably getting a phone call from contacts telling him that federal agents had just left Frank Mitchell's house with boxes of evidence. Somewhere, my mother was probably worrying about what I had done. And somewhere, my brother was probably calculating how this would affect his reputation. But for the first time in days, I felt like I had done something true, something that aligned with who I wanted to be rather than who my family needed me to be. The fear was still there, coiled tight in my chest. The uncertainty about what would happen next was overwhelming. But beneath it all was a strange sense of relief, the relief of finally choosing honesty over comfortable lies. Nicole's apartment in the Pearl District was warm and cluttered with books and plants, a space that felt lived in and safe. She made tea and ordered Thai food, and we sat on her couch talking through everything that had happened. She told me she was proud of me, that what I had done took real courage. I wasn't sure about courage. It felt more like I had simply reached a point where staying silent hurt more than speaking up. My phone buzzed around 8 in the evening. A text from my mother. Please tell me you didn't go to the FBI. I stared at the message for a long time before responding. I had to, Mom. I couldn't keep this secret. Her response came quickly, filled with typos that revealed her panic. Robert is furious. He says you've destroyed everything. He says there will be consequences. I showed the message to Nicole and she shook her head. That's intimidation. You should forward that to Agent Wilson. I did, screenshotting the conversation and emailing it to the address Wilson had provided. Another text arrived, this one from Brandon. Dad would be ashamed of what you've done. The words stung more than I expected, even though I had never called Frank Mitchell Dad. He had been Grandpa, the one who took me fishing, who taught me to change oil and fix a carburetor. But Brandon's message revealed something important. He was taking sides, aligning himself with Uncle Robert, choosing family loyalty over truth. I didn't respond to either of them. Friday morning, Nicole went to work and I stayed at her apartment, feeling unmoored and uncertain what to do with myself. I called the library and took a personal day, knowing I couldn't focus on shelving books and answering reference questions, while my entire world was being investigated by federal agents. I tried to read, tried to watch television, tried to do anything that would quiet the anxious loop of thoughts in my head. Nothing worked. Around noon, my phone rang with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mr. Mitchell? Agent Wilson's voice, calm and professional. I need to inform you of a development. We executed a search warrant at your Uncle Robert Mitchell's law office this morning. We found additional classified documents in his possession, some of them relating to your grandfather's work. We've also discovered evidence suggesting your uncle may have been acting as a liaison between your grandfather and certain private entities after Frank's official retirement. The information came at me too fast to process. My uncle had classified documents? He was involved in whatever Grandpa Frank had been doing? Wilson continued. We're bringing your uncle in for questioning. We'll also be interviewing your mother and brother. I want to prepare you for the fact that this investigation is going to become more visible. There may be media attention. Your family members may try to contact you, possibly to pressure you into changing your story. It's important that you don't engage with them directly. All communication should go through us. I felt like I was falling, the ground disappearing beneath my feet. Agent Wilson, what exactly was my grandfather involved in? There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. I can't give you details while the investigation is active, but I can tell you this much. Your grandfather was recruited by the CIA in the early 1950s. He worked as an intelligence officer under various covers for nearly 4 decades. Some of his operations were sanctioned. Others appear to have crossed legal boundaries. After his official retirement, he continued working through private channels, possibly selling information or facilitating activities that violated federal law. Your uncle seems to have been aware of at least some of this and may have been helping to conceal evidence or maintain connections that your grandfather established. The reality of it crashed over me in waves. My grandfather, the man who had seemed so ordinary, so devoted to his family and his small-town life, had been living a lie for 40 years. And my uncle, the successful attorney everyone respected, had been complicit in covering it up. How many people knew? How deep did the deception go? Agent Wilson's voice brought me back to the present. Mr. Mitchell, are you still there? Yes, I managed. I'm here. Good. Remember what I told you about safety. We have reason to believe your uncle may have contacts who won't be happy about this investigation coming to light. Stay vigilant. Stay with your friend. And call me if anything feels wrong. The afternoon stretched into evening, and I sat in Nicole's apartment watching the light change across the hardwood floors, unable to shake the feeling that I had set something catastrophic in motion. My phone remained silent after Agent Wilson's call, which somehow felt worse than if it had been ringing constantly. The quiet meant things were happening beyond my awareness. Investigations unfolding, questions being asked, my family members sitting in federal interview rooms trying to explain the unexplainable. Nicole came home around 6 carrying groceries and a determined expression that told me she had been thinking about my situation all day. She made dinner while I sat at the kitchen counter, grateful for the normalcy of watching someone chop vegetables and stir pasta sauce. Even though my appetite had disappeared somewhere around the moment I learned my uncle was being questioned by federal agents. We ate in her small dining nook, and she told me about her day at the newsroom, the story she was working on, the petty office politics that usually would have made me laugh but now felt like transmissions from another universe. After dinner, she opened her laptop and showed me what she had been researching during her lunch break. I've been digging into your grandfather's timeline. According to public records, Frank Mitchell was discharged from the Army in 1953 after serving in Korea. He returned to Oregon and married your grandmother in '54. But look at this. She pulled up a database of property records. Your grandparents didn't buy their house in Riverside until 1958. So where were they living for those 4 years? And look at this, during that same period, there are travel records showing Frank Mitchell entering and exiting the country multiple times, destinations including Germany, Turkey, and the Philippines. I leaned closer to the screen, reading the dates and locations. My grandmother never mentioned living anywhere but Riverside. She died when I was 12, but I remember her talking about that house like they had always been there, like it was the only home she had ever known. Nicole clicked through more records. There are gaps, Derek. Whole years where there's no clear documentation of where they were or what they were doing. That's consistent with someone living undercover, moving frequently, maintaining a false identity. And then suddenly in '58, they appear in Riverside with a conventional life, a house, a business, everything perfectly ordinary. The picture she was painting made my grandfather's double life feel even more calculated. It wasn't just that he had secrets. It was that every detail of his visible existence had been constructed deliberately to hide the truth. The mechanic shop, the church attendance, the community involvement, all of it carefully maintained camouflage. How much of his relationship with my grandmother had been real? Had she known what he was? Had their entire marriage been part of his cover? Nicole must have seen the questions in my face because she reached across the table and took my hand. I know this is overwhelming. I know you're probably questioning everything you thought you knew about your family. But Derek, you can't blame yourself for any of this. You didn't create these lies. You just found them. There's a difference. Her words helped, but they couldn't erase the sense of betrayal that had settled into my bones. I had loved my grandfather. I had trusted him completely. And now every memory felt tainted. Every fishing trip and chess game shadowed by the knowledge that he had been hiding his true self from me the entire time. Saturday morning arrived with fog rolling in from the river, turning the city soft and indistinct. I woke early on Nicole's couch where I had insisted on sleeping, not wanting to take over her bedroom, and lay there listening to the muffled sounds of Portland waking up around me. My phone showed 7 missed calls from my mother and 3 from Brandon, but no voicemails. They were trying to reach me but apparently had nothing they wanted to say on record. I made coffee and was standing at Nicole's kitchen window watching the fog drift between buildings when my phone finally rang with a number I recognized. Agent Wilson. I answered immediately, my heart already accelerating. Mr. Mitchell, we've completed initial interviews with your family members. I need to brief you on what we've learned. Can you come to the field office this morning? I told him I could be there within the hour. Nicole drove me downtown again, the route already becoming familiar in a way that felt surreal. How had my life become a series of trips to federal buildings and conversations with agents investigating my own family? We parked in the garage beneath the building, and I rode the elevator to the 5th floor with my stomach churning. Agent Wilson met me in the lobby and led me back to the same conference room where this had all begun just 2 days earlier. He laid out a folder on the table between us, and I recognized copies of some of the documents I had found in my grandfather's attic. Your Uncle Robert was cooperative once he understood we already had significant evidence. He's provided a statement detailing his involvement with your grandfather's activities. Wilson opened the folder and showed me a typed transcript. According to Robert, your grandfather approached him in 2008, right around the time of the financial crisis. Frank told him that he had established certain financial arrangements during his intelligence career, offshore accounts and trusts that contained significant funds. He needed legal assistance to access and manage those funds without drawing attention from federal authorities. I stared at the transcript, trying to absorb the implications. So Uncle Robert was helping Grandpa Frank move money? Wilson nodded. More than that. Your grandfather had maintained relationships with former intelligence contacts, some of whom had gone into private sector work, security consulting, corporate intelligence, that kind of thing. Frank was brokering information and connections between these individuals and clients who were willing to pay for access to intelligence networks. Robert was handling the legal structures that made it look legitimate: shell corporations, consulting agreements, things that appeared above board but were actually facilitating the transfer of classified information. The scope of it was staggering. This wasn't just an old spy keeping souvenirs from his career. This was an ongoing criminal enterprise that had continued for years after Frank's supposed retirement, And my uncle had been an active participant. What about my mother and brother? Did they know? Wilson's expression softened slightly. Your mother claims she knew your grandfather had done intelligence work, but insists she wasn't aware of any illegal activities. She says Robert told her to never ask questions about Frank's finances or business relationships. As for your brother, he appears to have been genuinely ignorant of the details. He knew Robert and Frank had some kind of business arrangement, but he thought it was related to your grandfather's military pension and estate planning. So my mother had chosen willful ignorance, accepting the benefits of whatever money was flowing through the family, while deliberately not looking at where it came from. And Brandon had been kept in the dark, probably because he couldn't be trusted to keep quiet about something that might damage his precious reputation. The different levels of complicity were almost as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Agent Torres entered the room carrying another folder, this one thicker. She sat down across from me and opened it carefully. Mr. Mitchell, we've been reviewing the financial records associated with your grandfather's offshore accounts. There are transactions dating back to the 1970s, payments from entities we've identified as front companies for foreign intelligence services. Your grandfather was selling information to multiple buyers over several decades. Some of that information was classified intelligence he obtained during his CIA career. Other information appears to have been collected through surveillance and espionage activities he conducted independently after his official retirement. The word espionage hung in the air like something physical. My grandfather hadn't just been keeping secrets or bending rules. He had been actively spying, selling American intelligence to foreign powers, betraying the country he had supposedly served. The magnitude of his betrayal made me feel sick. Torres continued, her voice steady and professional. We've also found evidence that some of the operations your grandfather facilitated resulted in harm to active intelligence officers. In 1983, a CIA operation in Eastern Europe was compromised, resulting in the death of 2 American officers. We have reason to believe the compromise originated with information your grandfather sold to a Soviet contact. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table trying to process what she was telling me. My grandfather had gotten people killed? People who were working for the same agency he had once served? Wilson leaned forward, his voice gentle. I know this is difficult to hear, but you need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Your grandfather's activities weren't just white-collar crimes or technical violations of classification rules. People died because of what he did. Families were destroyed. Operations that took years to build were burned. And he did it for money for decades without apparent remorse. I couldn't speak. My throat had closed up, and my eyes burned with tears I refused to let fall. The man who had taught me to fish, who had sat with me in companionable silence on his front porch, who had seemed so gentle and kind, had been responsible for the deaths of American intelligence officers. How was that possible? How could someone contain that much darkness while presenting such an ordinary, decent face to the world? Torres pushed a box of tissues across the table. I know you loved him. That doesn't change just because you've learned the truth about what he did. But Mr. Mitchell, you need to understand that coming forward with these documents may have prevented further damage. We believe your grandfather was still active up until the time of his death. If you hadn't found those documents, if you hadn't brought them to us, his network might have continued operating through your uncle and others. The idea that I had stopped something, that my accidental discovery and decision to report it had actually mattered, provided a small measure of comfort in the midst of overwhelming grief. Wilson closed the folder in front of him. We're going to need you to provide a formal statement for the record. We'll also need you to testify before a grand jury when we move forward with charges against your uncle. Are you prepared to do that? I nodded, still not trusting my voice. Yes, whatever you need. The formal statement took most of the afternoon. I sat in a different conference room with a stenographer recording every word while Agent Wilson walked me through the timeline of discovering the documents, my family's reaction, and everything I could remember about my grandfather's behavior that might be relevant to the investigation. I told them about the trips Frank used to take when I was young, disappearing for weeks at a time with vague explanations about visiting old military friends. I described the secure phone line he had in his garage office, the one he told us was for his mechanic business, but that he always answered in a voice different from his normal tone. Small details I had never questioned as a child now revealed themselves as operational security measures. The way he never discussed his past in any specific detail. The way he discouraged family members from talking about him to outsiders. The way he had separate post office boxes for different kinds of mail. Every quirk and eccentricity I had attributed to an old man's habits had actually been the careful behavior of someone living a covert life. When the statement was finally complete, Wilson walked me out to the lobby where Nicole was waiting, having spent the afternoon working on her laptop in the building's cafe. She stood when she saw me, reading my exhausted expression, and put her arm around my shoulders without asking questions. Wilson handed me a card with multiple contact numbers. Call anytime, day or night. We've assigned a protective detail to keep an eye on your movements for the next few weeks. Just as a precaution. You won't see them, but they'll be there. If you notice anyone following you or approaching you about your grandfather, contact us immediately. The idea that I needed protection, that there were people who might want to hurt me because of what I had uncovered, made the whole situation feel even more surreal. Nicole guided me out to her car, and we drove back to her apartment in silence. The city was transitioning into evening, lights beginning to glow in windows, people heading home from work or out to dinner, everyone moving through their normal lives while mine had fractured into something unrecognizable. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on Nicole's couch staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every interaction I had ever had with my grandfather, reinterpreting everything through the lens of what I now knew. The pride in his eyes when I graduated high school, was that real, or was I just another element of his cover story? The stories he told about Korea, how much was true and how much was misdirection? The advice he had given me over the years about integrity and honesty, had he seen the irony or had he genuinely believed he was teaching me something valuable while living a lie himself? Sunday morning I finally gave in and checked the voicemails my mother and Brandon had left. My mother's voice was strained, breaking in places. Derek, please call me back. I know you're angry, but we need to talk about this as a family. Robert has been arrested. They took him away in handcuffs. The press is starting to call. I don't know what to do. Please, sweetheart, please call me. I need you. Brandon's message was shorter and angrier. Thanks a lot, Derek. Dad's firm is already losing clients because of this. Mom is having some kind of breakdown. And for what? Some old documents that don't even matter anymore? Grandpa is dead. Whatever he did, it's over. But you had to play hero and now you've destroyed this entire family. I hope you're proud of yourself. The accusation stung even though I had expected it. In their minds, I was the problem. I was the one who had shattered the family by refusing to maintain the comfortable fiction we had all been living. The fact that the fiction had been built on treason and death apparently didn't matter as much as preserving our public image. I deleted both messages without responding. Nicole made breakfast and sat with me while I pushed eggs around my plate without eating. She had pulled her dark hair back in a ponytail, and her brown eyes held a mixture of concern and determination. You know you're going to have to face them eventually. Not because you owe them anything, but because you need closure. You need to tell them to their faces why you did what you did. I knew she was right, but the thought of confronting my mother and Brandon filled me with dread. What would I even say? How do you explain to people who chose comfortable lies over difficult truth that you couldn't make the same choice? The decision was taken out of my hands Monday morning, when my mother showed up at Nicole's apartment building. The buzzer rang at 7:30, startling both of us, and Nicole went to the intercom. A woman's voice tight with desperation. I need to see Derek. Please. It's his mother. Nicole looked at me, eyebrows raised in question. I nodded, resigned. Let her up. My mother looked like she had aged a decade in the 4 days since I had last seen her. Her hair was uncombed, her face bare of the makeup she usually wore, her clothes wrinkled as if she had slept in them. She stood in the doorway of Nicole's apartment, and when she saw me, something in her face crumpled. How could you do this to us? Not even hello. Not any acknowledgement of the gravity of what had been revealed. Just immediate accusation wrapped in maternal hurt. I stood up from the couch, forcing myself to meet her eyes. How could I do this? Mom, did you hear what the FBI told you? Grandpa Frank was selling classified information. He got people killed. And Uncle Robert was helping him hide it. How could I not report that? She stepped into the apartment, her hands twisting together. He was your grandfather. He loved you. Whatever mistakes he made, they were in the past. You should have come to the family first. We could have handled this privately. The word mistakes hit me like a slap. Mistakes. As if treason and espionage and getting intelligence officers killed were equivalent to forgetting someone's birthday or bouncing a check. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and clarifying. These weren't mistakes, Mom. This was a choice he made over and over for decades. And you knew. Maybe not all the details, but you knew enough to understand something wasn't right, and you chose not to ask questions because it was easier. She flinched as if I had struck her. I was trying to protect this family. I was trying to keep us together. That's what mothers do. They protect their children. And I failed. I failed because you wouldn't let me. I shook my head, the anger giving way to something deeper, sadder. You didn't fail because of me. You failed because you protected the wrong things. You protected secrets and lies and Uncle Robert's involvement in criminal activity. But you didn't protect me. When I found those documents, when I needed guidance about what to do, you didn't help me make an ethical decision. You just wanted me to make the convenient one. Nicole had quietly moved to the kitchen, giving us space but staying close enough to intervene if needed. My mother sank onto the couch, her face in her hands. Robert is going to prison. They're saying he could get 20 years. And they're investigating Frank's estate. They might seize everything, the house, the accounts, all of it. What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to survive this? The questions were genuine, her fear real, but I couldn't summon the sympathy she was asking for. You'll survive it the same way everyone else survives consequences for their choices. You'll adapt. You'll rebuild. But Mom, you have to understand, none of this is happening because I found those documents. This is happening because Grandpa Frank committed serious crimes and Uncle Robert helped him. I just refused to be part of covering it up. She looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. You sound so cold, so self-righteous. You have no idea what it's like to be in my position, to watch your family fall apart and know your own son caused it. I felt the familiar pull of guilt, the old instinct to apologize and soothe and make everything easier for her. But I resisted it, recognizing it for what it was, an attempt to make me responsible for her feelings instead of holding her accountable for her choices. I didn't cause this. I just stopped pretending it wasn't happening. There's a difference. She stood abruptly, her momentary vulnerability hardening into anger. Fine. You want to be the righteous one, the one who tells the truth no matter who it hurts? Then you get to live with that. But don't expect me to forgive you. Don't expect to be welcomed back into this family when you're done playing hero. We were a family before you decided we weren't good enough for your moral standards. She left without waiting for a response, the door closing behind her with a soft click that felt more final than a slam would have. I stood in the middle of Nicole's living room, trembling with adrenaline and grief, and Nicole came over and wrapped me in a hug that I desperately needed. You did the right thing, she whispered. Even when it hurts, even when they hate you for it, you did the right thing. The week that followed passed in a blur of legal proceedings and media attention. The story broke publicly on Wednesday when a local news outlet reported that a prominent Portland attorney had been arrested on charges related to espionage and conspiracy. They didn't name my grandfather initially, referring to him only as a deceased former intelligence officer, but it didn't take long for enterprising journalists to piece together the connections. By Friday, Frank Mitchell's name was being reported alongside details about his decades of selling classified information. My phone became unusable, flooded with calls from reporters wanting interviews, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly concerned about the family's reputation, and blocked numbers that I suspected were from people connected to my grandfather's network. Agent Wilson had warned me this would happen, and he had been right. The protective detail he mentioned became more visible. Men in dark SUVs parked near Nicole's building. Unfamiliar faces watching from across the street when I left for work. The library granted me a temporary leave of absence, ostensibly for my own safety, but probably also because they didn't want media attention disrupting their operations. I spent my days in Nicole's apartment, reading everything I could find about espionage cases, trying to understand the world my grandfather had inhabited. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Frank Mitchell had been a true believer who became disillusioned and then mercenary. His early intelligence work during the Cold War had probably started from patriotic motives, but somewhere along the way he had stopped believing in the cause and started believing in his own survival and enrichment. Nicole's editor asked her to write a feature article about the case. Recognizing that her connection to me gave her unique access to the human element of the story, she asked my permission first, making it clear she wouldn't proceed if I was uncomfortable, but I told her to write it. The truth was going to come out regardless. Better that it came from someone who would treat me fairly and understand the complexity of discovering that your family legacy is built on betrayal. The grand jury proceedings began in early October. I testified for 3 hours, walking them through the discovery of the documents, my family's reaction, and everything I had learned since. The assistant U.S. attorney handling the case was a woman named Sarah Chan, sharp and thorough, who treated me with a combination of professional distance and genuine kindness. She explained that they were building cases against multiple individuals connected to my grandfather's network, but Uncle Robert would be the highest profile prosecution because of his ongoing involvement and his position as an attorney who had used his legal expertise to facilitate criminal activity. Sitting in the grand jury room, answering questions from citizens who had been pulled from their ordinary lives to evaluate evidence of extraordinary crimes, I felt the weight of what I had set in motion. These people would decide whether there was enough evidence to formally charge my uncle. Their decision would determine whether Robert Mitchell went to trial, whether his legal career ended, whether he spent the next decades of his life in federal prison. And it had all started because I refused to put some old documents back in a footlocker and pretend I hadn't seen them. The grand jury returned an indictment within a week. Robert Mitchell was formally charged with conspiracy to commit espionage, money laundering, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of facilitating the transmission of classified information. The indictment was unsealed on a Friday afternoon, and by evening it was leading news stories across the country. A successful attorney brought down by his father-in-law's espionage network, the justice system turning against one of its own. Brandon called me that night, his voice shaking with rage. "I hope you're satisfied. I hope destroying Robert's life makes you feel good about yourself. Dad's clients are abandoning him. His reputation is ruined. And Mom, she can barely function. She's on medication now because she can't sleep. But you don't care about any of that, do you? You got your moment of moral superiority, and that's all that matters to you." I listened to him vent, recognizing that beneath the anger was genuine pain and confusion. Brandon had built his identity around being part of a successful, respectable family. Learning that the foundation of that respectability was rotten had shattered something in him, and he needed someone to blame. I was convenient, visible, and had made the choice he couldn't understand. When he finally wound down, I spoke quietly. "I care that Mom is hurting. I care that this is hard for you. But Brandon, Uncle Robert made his own choices. He knew what Grandpa Frank was involved in and he helped anyway. That's not on me. That's on him. You want to be angry at someone? Be angry at the people who created this situation, not the person who finally told the truth about it." He hung up without responding, and I knew it would be a long time before he could see past his anger to understand my perspective. Maybe he never would. Some people need their villains to be external, need to believe that problems come from outside disruptions rather than internal rot. I had become the external disruption in Brandon's narrative, the troublemaker who had upset a stable system, and no amount of evidence about that system's corruption would change his need to blame me. The trial began in late November, just as the Pacific Northwest settled into its long gray winter. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland became the center of my universe for 6 weeks. A marble and granite building where the secrets my family had kept for decades were finally exposed to public scrutiny. I attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecution table, feeling the weight of Uncle Robert's stare on the back of my neck. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Sarah Chan walked the jury through the timeline of Frank Mitchell's intelligence career, starting with his legitimate service in Korea, and tracing his gradual transformation from patriot to traitor. She presented evidence of the offshore accounts Robert had helped establish, the shell corporations he had created to launder money, the legal opinions he had drafted that provided cover for transactions that were clearly criminal. Each piece of evidence was presented with careful precision, building a picture of sustained criminal conspiracy that lasted more than a decade. Robert's defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Marcus Brennan who had flown in from Washington, D.C. specifically for this case, tried to argue that Robert had been manipulated by his father-in-law, that he had believed Frank's activities were legitimate consulting work, that he had been kept in the dark about the true nature of the operations he was facilitating. But the prosecution had emails, recorded phone calls, and financial records that showed Robert had known exactly what he was doing. In one particularly damning email, Robert had written to Frank about the need to sanitize the documentation before a scheduled audit, language that made his awareness of criminal activity unmistakable. I was called to testify on the 8th day of the trial. Walking to the witness stand felt like moving through water, every step requiring conscious effort. The eyes of the jury and the packed gallery following my progress. I was sworn in, and Sarah Chun approached with a gentle expression that I had come to recognize as her way of putting nervous witnesses at ease. She walked me through the discovery of the documents, asking me to describe in detail the false bottom of the footlocker, the waterproof envelope, the moment I realized what I was looking at. Then she asked the question I had been dreading. Mr. Mitchell, when you showed these documents to your family, how did your Uncle Robert respond? I took a breath and met her eyes, drawing strength from her steady presence. He told me the documents were classified, and that I had committed a federal crime by possessing them. He demanded that I turn them over to him immediately. He said that as executor of my grandfather's estate, they legally belonged to him, and he threatened to take legal action against me if I didn't comply. Sarah Chun nodded, making notes on her legal pad. Did he seem surprised by the contents of these documents? I thought about it carefully, remembering that moment in my mother's living room when Robert had opened the folder and his entire demeanor had changed. No. He seemed angry and worried, but not surprised. It felt like he already knew what was in them, or at least knew enough to understand why they were dangerous. The cross-examination was brutal. Marcus Brennan came at me with barely concealed hostility, suggesting that I had misinterpreted my uncle's reaction, that I had exaggerated his threats, that I had been motivated by family resentments rather than genuine concern about classified information. He painted me as an underachieving nephew jealous of his successful uncle, someone who had seized on ambiguous documents as a way to bring down a family member who had overshadowed him. Some of it was artful fiction, some of it cut closer to uncomfortable truths about my relationship with Robert. But through it all I kept my composure and stuck to the facts of what I had found and what had happened afterward. When I finally stepped down from the witness stand, my shirt was soaked with sweat and my hands were shaking. I had done what I came to do, told the truth under oath, but it had cost me something. Seeing Robert's face throughout my testimony, watching him mouth words to his attorney, knowing he was trying to destroy my credibility, hammered home the reality that my family had fully turned against me. This wasn't a misunderstanding that would heal with time. This was a permanent fracture, a choosing of sides that would define relationships for whatever remained of my life. Nicole had taken time off work to attend the trial with me, and she was waiting outside the courtroom when I emerged. She didn't say anything, just pulled me into a hug that I held onto longer than was probably appropriate for a public hallway. That night we went to a quiet restaurant far from downtown, somewhere the trial wouldn't find us, and she let me talk through everything I was feeling. The guilt about testifying against family, the anger at being attacked for telling the truth, the grief about my grandfather that had never fully resolved and probably never would. The prosecution rested their case after 3 weeks, and the defense put on a brief and ultimately unconvincing rebuttal. Robert himself chose not to testify, probably on his attorney's advice, but his silence felt like an admission. If he had truly believed in his innocence, if he had genuinely been deceived by Frank Mitchell, wouldn't he want to tell that story in his own words? His absence from the stand spoke volumes about the weakness of his defense. The jury deliberated for 2 days. I spent that time in a coffee shop near the courthouse, unable to concentrate on anything, jumping every time my phone buzzed with an update from Sarah Chun. On the afternoon of the second day, the message came. Verdict is in. They're reconvening in 30 minutes. Nicole drove me to the courthouse, and we made our way through increased security and gathered media to reach the courtroom before the jury returned. The forewoman stood when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict, and her voice was clear and certain as she read from the paper in her hands. On the count of conspiracy to commit espionage, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of money laundering, we find the defendant guilty. Count after count, the word guilty repeated with the steady rhythm of justice finally being served. I watched Robert's face as the verdict was read, And I saw the moment he understood that his life as he had known it was over. His shoulders sagged. His head dropped. Whatever defiance he had maintained throughout the trial evaporated in the face of unanimous conviction. Sentencing was scheduled for January. The prosecution was asking for 25 years based on the severity of the crimes and the damage Robert's actions had caused to national security. The defense would argue for leniency, for credit based on Robert's years of public service and charitable work, but everyone in that courtroom knew he was going to prison for a significant portion of whatever remained of his life. He was 58 years old. Even with a reduced sentence, he would likely die behind bars. I felt no satisfaction watching him led away by federal marshals. I had thought I might feel vindicated or relieved, but instead I just felt empty. This man who had been a fixture of my childhood, who had seemed so powerful and untouchable, was now just another criminal paying the price for his choices. And my family would never forgive me for the role I had played in bringing him to this point, even though that role had simply been refusing to participate in covering up his crimes. The media coverage intensified after the verdict. My name was now public record, identified in news articles as the nephew who had discovered the documents that exposed the entire network. Reporters camped outside Nicole's building, trying to get interviews, photos, anything that would feed the public appetite for this story of family betrayal and espionage. Agent Wilson arranged for me to be moved to a secure location for a few weeks, a bland apartment in a suburb I had never visited, where I could decompress away from the constant attention. It was in that anonymous apartment, surrounded by generic furniture and bare walls, that I finally allowed myself to fully grieve. Not just for my grandfather and the lies he had lived, not just for the family relationships that had been destroyed, but for the version of myself that had existed before I opened that footlocker. The Derek Mitchell who had believed in the fundamental goodness of his family, who had trusted that the people who raised him had been honest about who they were, that person was gone. In his place was someone harder, more skeptical, but also more honest about the complexity of human nature and the ways people could rationalize terrible things. Christmas came and went without any contact from my mother or Brandon. I spent the holiday with Nicole and her family, who welcomed me with the kind of uncomplicated warmth that made me realize how conditional my own family's love had been. Nicole's parents asked thoughtful questions about the trial without being invasive. Her younger sister talked about her college applications and treated me like a normal person rather than a curiosity or a villain. Around their dinner table, passing dishes and laughing at family jokes I didn't quite understand, I caught a glimpse of what family could be when it wasn't built on secrets and denial. January brought Robert's sentencing hearing. I attended, knowing it would likely be the last time I saw him outside of prison. The courtroom was less crowded than during the trial, the media having mostly moved on to other scandals, but my mother and Brandon were there, sitting on Robert's side of the gallery. They didn't look at me when I entered. They didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. I might as well have been invisible. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Hayworth, known for her measured approach to sentencing. She listened to the defense's arguments for leniency, to character witnesses who spoke about Robert's pro bono work, and his contributions to legal education. Then she listened to Sarah Chin detail the harm that Robert's actions had caused, the intelligence operations that had been compromised, the officers whose safety had been jeopardized, the ongoing damage to national security that would take years to fully assess. When it was time for the judge to speak, her voice filled the courtroom with quiet authority. "Mr. Mitchell, you were an officer of the court. You took an oath to uphold the law. Instead, you used your legal expertise to facilitate crimes against your own country. You helped conceal espionage. You laundered money derived from the sale of classified information. And you did all of this not out of ideology or coercion, but for financial gain. The harm you have caused is profound and far-reaching. This court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole." The number fell like a physical weight. 22 years. Robert would be 80 before he was eligible for release, assuming he survived that long. I saw my mother's shoulders shake with silent sobs. I saw Brandon put his arm around her, his face a mask of controlled rage. And I saw Robert stand there, expressionless, as marshals approached to take him into custody. Before they led him away, Robert turned and looked directly at me for the first time since the trial had begun. His eyes held no remorse, no understanding, just a cold hatred that made it clear he blamed me entirely for his situation. Not Frank, who had recruited him into criminal activity. Not himself, who had made the choice to participate. Just me, the family member who had refused to protect him at the cost of truth and justice. I held his gaze until the marshals turned him away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions that I didn't answer. Nicole guided me to her car, and we drove away from downtown, away from the aftermath of justice, towards something that might eventually resemble a normal life. That evening, sitting in my secure apartment, I received an email from Agent Wilson. He wanted to meet one more time, to provide closure on the investigation, and to discuss some discoveries they had made while dismantling Frank Mitchell's network. We met at a quiet restaurant the next afternoon, a booth in the back where we could talk without being overheard. Wilson looked tired, as if the months of investigation had taken their toll on him as well. He slid a folder across the table, and I opened it to find photographs I had never seen before. My grandfather as a young man, standing with other men in military uniforms, his face serious and proud. A wedding photo of Frank and my grandmother, both of them impossibly young and full of hope. And then later photos showing Frank with people I didn't recognize in locations that looked foreign and vaguely threatening. These are from his CIA file, Wilson explained. We were able to access it once the criminal investigation was underway. Your grandfather was recruited in 1951, while he was still in the Army. He showed aptitude for languages and an ability to blend into different environments. They trained him in intelligence gathering and ran him in Korea under military cover. After the war, he transitioned to civilian cover and worked in Europe and Asia for nearly 3 decades. I studied the photos, trying to reconcile the young man in these images with the grandfather I had known. When did he turn? When did he start selling information? Wilson took a sip of his coffee. We think it started in the mid-70s. He was stationed in Southeast Asia, and there's evidence he made contact with a Soviet handler. The initial motivation seems to have been financial. He and your grandmother were struggling, medical bills from a pregnancy that ended in miscarriage, debts that were piling up. The Soviets offered him money for relatively low-level information, and once he crossed that line, they had leverage to demand more. So he started as a patriot and became a traitor because of money? Wilson nodded slowly. Most espionage cases come down to one of 4 motivations: money, ideology, compromise, or ego. Your grandfather's case was primarily financial, but there was probably an element of ego as well. He believed he was smarter than his handlers, that he could play both sides and never get caught. And for a long time he was right. We didn't detect his activities until long after he had officially retired. And by then the damage was done. I closed the folder, not wanting to look at those images anymore. What happens now? To his legacy, to the people he worked with, to all of it? Wilson leaned back in the booth. His name will be added to the list of known American intelligence officers who committed espionage. There will be damage assessments that take years to complete. Some operations that failed during his active period will be re-examined to determine if he was the source of compromise. And we're still tracking down the people in his network who haven't been caught yet. It's going to take time, but we'll dismantle what he built. The idea that my grandfather's betrayal would echo through the intelligence community for years to come was overwhelming. He had been one person, one spy among many, but his actions had ripples that spread far beyond his small life in Riverside, Oregon. How many careers had been affected? How many operations had failed? How many people had died or been imprisoned because of information he sold? The accounting would never be complete, and I would carry that knowledge with me for the rest of my life. Wilson reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. One more thing. We found this among your grandfather's papers. It's addressed to you. He must have written it shortly before he died, but he never sent it. I thought you should have it. My hands trembled as I took the envelope, recognizing my grandfather's handwriting on the front. Derek Mitchell, private. The word private was underlined twice, as if he wanted to make absolutely certain only I would read whatever was inside. I waited until I was back in my apartment to open it, needing privacy for whatever message my grandfather had left for me. The letter was written on plain paper, his handwriting shakier than I remembered, evidence of the illness that had taken him. It began without preamble, direct and unsentimental in a way that was characteristic of how he had spoken to me in life. Derek, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and you've probably found some things I never meant for you to discover. I've thought a lot about what I would say to you if this moment came, and I've decided the only thing I can offer is honesty, which is ironic given how much of my life was built on lies. I was a spy, a real one, and for many years I believed I was serving my country with distinction. But the truth is I served myself first, my country second, and my family hardly at all. The people I worked for in the beginning told me I was protecting American interests. They told me the intelligence I gathered would keep us safe from enemies who wanted to destroy our way of life. I believed them because I needed to believe in something larger than myself. But somewhere in the middle of my career, I stopped believing in causes and started believing in survival. I made compromises. I sold information to people I shouldn't have. I justified it by telling myself that everyone in the intelligence world plays both sides, that loyalty is just another commodity to be traded. I know this probably sounds like I'm making excuses, and maybe I am. But Derek, I want you to understand something important. The life I built in Riverside, the garage, the fishing trips with you, the Sunday dinners and the quiet routines, that wasn't entirely a cover. Those things were real. You were real to me. When I taught you to change oil or cast a fishing line, I wasn't performing for an audience. I was trying to be the person I might have been if I had made different choices. I've done things I can't undo and hurt people I can never apologize to. I've betrayed trusts and broken oaths and accumulated enough guilt to crush a stronger man. But in the moments I spent with you, watching you grow into someone thoughtful and kind, I felt like maybe I hadn't completely failed at being human. You reminded me of who I wanted to be before the world taught me to be someone else. If you found my documents, you're probably facing an impossible choice right now. Do you protect the family by keeping quiet? Or do you expose the truth and accept the consequences? I can't tell you what to do, Derek. I lost the right to offer you moral guidance a long time ago. But I can tell you this, whatever you decide, make sure it's a choice you can live with. Don't let anyone else make it for you. Not your mother. Not Robert. Not anyone who wants to use your loyalty against you. You've always been the best of us, the one who actually has a moral compass that works. I saw that in you even when you were small, the way you couldn't stand unfairness, the way you always wanted to understand why things were the way they were. Hold on to that. Don't let this world or this family convince you to be less than you are. I'm sorry I couldn't be honest with you while I was alive. I'm sorry for the burden I'm leaving you. And I'm sorry that learning the truth about me will probably change how you remember the time we spent together. But know this, whatever else I was, whatever crimes I committed, my love for you was real. You were the one purely good thing in my complicated life. And I hope you can forgive an old spy for wanting to be your grandfather instead of just another casualty of the Cold War. Take care of yourself, Derek. Be braver than I was. Be better than I was. And if you find yourself in trouble because of what I've done, remember that you didn't create this mess. You just inherited it. That's not your fault, and you don't owe loyalty to lies, no matter who tells them. With more affection than I probably deserve, Frank Mitchell. I read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face that I didn't bother to wipe away. It didn't excuse anything. It didn't undo the harm he had caused or the lives he had destroyed. But it was honest in a way nothing else in his life had been. And it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed: permission to forgive him while still holding him accountable, permission to remember the good moments without pretending the terrible things hadn't happened. The letter also gave me clarity about the choice I had made. My grandfather had been right about one thing: I couldn't stand unfairness, couldn't tolerate lies even when they were comfortable. Turning in those documents hadn't been about revenge or moral superiority. It had been about refusing to be complicit in a system built on deception, about choosing the kind of person I wanted to be over the kind of person my family needed me to be. February brought the first signs of spring. Early crocuses pushing through the wet earth in Nicole's neighborhood. The days gradually lengthening into something that felt like hope. The media attention had faded, replaced by newer scandals and more immediate crises. I was able to return to work at the library, falling back into the comfortable rhythms of books and research and helping patrons find information. My coworkers were kind enough not to ask questions, treating me the same as they always had, which was a gift I didn't take for granted. Agent Wilson called one last time in early March to tell me the investigation was officially closed. They had identified and dismantled the remaining elements of Frank Mitchell's network, recovering millions of dollars in laundered funds and securing classified materials that had been scattered across multiple locations. The damage assessment was still ongoing, but the active threat had been neutralized. He thanked me for my cooperation and told me I could finally move forward with my life. Moving forward proved easier in theory than practice. I still had nightmares about the trial, about testifying against my uncle, about opening that footlocker and finding the documents that changed everything. I still jumped when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. And I still felt the absence of my family like a physical wound, the knowledge that my mother and Brandon existed somewhere in the same city, but might as well have been on another planet for all the contact we had. But I also started to build something new. Nicole and I grew closer, our friendship deepening into something more complicated and hopeful. I started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma, working through the layers of grief and guilt and anger that came with learning your grandfather was a traitor. I volunteered at a local veterans organization, finding some measure of peace in helping other military families navigate the complicated legacy of service. And I started writing, documenting everything that had happened, not for publication but for myself, trying to make sense of the story I had become part of. The act of putting words on paper helped me process the experience, helped me see patterns and connections I had missed while living through it. It helped me understand that I hadn't destroyed my family, I had simply refused to maintain the fiction that held it together. The destruction had always been there, hidden beneath the surface. I had just brought it into the light. One afternoon in late April, I was shelving books in the library's history section when I came across a volume about espionage during the Cold War. I pulled it out, curious, and found a chapter about Operation Broken Arrow, one of the operations mentioned in my grandfather's documents. The book described it as a joint CIA-MI6 operation in East Berlin that had been compromised in 1983, resulting in the death of 2 American officers and the collapse of a network that had taken years to build. I stood there in the quiet library, holding the book, and realized I was reading about the real consequences of my grandfather's betrayal. These weren't abstract casualties or theoretical harm. These were real people with real families, people who had believed in something larger than themselves and paid the ultimate price for that belief. My grandfather had sold them out for money, and they had died, and their families had grieved, and the world had moved on without knowing the truth about what happened. I checked out the book and took it home, reading it cover to cover in one sitting. The author had clearly been working with incomplete information, unable to identify the source of the compromise that doomed Operation Broken Arrow. But I knew exactly who had betrayed them and why. And I knew that without my decision to report those documents, that truth might have stayed hidden forever, my grandfather's crimes buried with him, the families of those officers never knowing that their loved ones' deaths could have been prevented. That knowledge settled something in me, easing a guilt I hadn't fully acknowledged. I had done the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the thing that would have kept my family intact, but the right thing. And whatever the cost, whatever relationships I had lost and whatever comfort I had sacrificed, I could live with that choice. I could look at myself in the mirror without flinching. I could carry forward knowing I had chosen truth over convenience, justice over family loyalty, courage over comfort. Summer arrived with clear skies and warm winds, and I finally felt ready to visit my grandfather's grave. I hadn't been back to Pinehurst Cemetery since the funeral, unable to face the physical marker of his life when I was still processing everything I had learned about it. But one Saturday in June, I drove to Riverside and parked near the entrance, walking through rows of headstones until I found his. Frank Mitchell, beloved husband, father and grandfather. The words were accurate and completely inadequate, capturing none of the complexity of who he had actually been. I stood there for a long time, not praying exactly but trying to find some kind of closure. I thought about the letter he had left me, his admission of failure and his hope that I would be better than he was. I thought about the fishing trips and chess games, the moments that had been real even inside a life built on lies. And I thought about the choice I had made, the choice he had essentially given me permission to make by telling me to be braver than he was. I spoke out loud, my voice barely above a whisper. I did what you knew I would do. I told the truth. I know you probably hoped I wouldn't find those documents, that they would stay hidden and I could remember you the way I wanted to. But I did find them and I couldn't pretend I hadn't. I hope you understand. I hope somewhere, whatever part of you was real and good understands why I had to do it. The cemetery was quiet except for birdsong and distant traffic. No one answered my words, but I hadn't expected them to. This wasn't about receiving absolution from my grandfather. This was about giving myself permission to remember him as a complicated, flawed human being rather than either a hero or a monster. He had been both and neither, a man who made terrible choices and lived with them, who caused real harm and also created real moments of connection and love. I left a small stone on his headstone, a Jewish tradition I had read about, a way of marking that someone had visited and remembered. Then I walked back to my car and drove away from Riverside, knowing I probably wouldn't return for a long time. That chapter of my life was closed, not forgotten but finished, filed away in memory where it could no longer hurt me in active, immediate ways. Nicole and I moved in together in August, finding a small house in southeast Portland with a garden where we could grow tomatoes and herbs. It felt like starting over, building something new in a space that wasn't haunted by family expectations or hidden secrets. We painted walls and argued about furniture and figured out how to share space in the way new couples do. And through it all I felt lighter than I had in years. My mother reached out once, a brief email in September asking if we could talk. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop halfway between her world and mine. She looked older, worn down by the year that had passed, but there was something different in her eyes, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. She apologized, not for everything but for enough. She admitted she had chosen comfort over truth, that she had known more than she claimed, and had looked away because looking directly at reality was too painful. I accepted her apology but made it clear that rebuilding our relationship would take time, and would require her to accept that I wouldn't apologize for my choices. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and said she understood. We parted with a tentative hug, both of us knowing we might never be close again but willing to leave the door open for possibility. Brandon never reached out, and I made peace with that loss. Some relationships don't survive honesty, and trying to force reconciliation would only create more pain. I hoped that someday he would understand why I did what I did, but I couldn't control his perspective or his anger. I could only control my own actions and my own conscience. The 1-year anniversary of finding the documents passed quietly. I marked it by taking myself to dinner at a restaurant with a view of the river, toasting silently to survival and truth, and the courage it takes to choose your own integrity over other people's expectations. The city lights reflected on the water, beautiful and indifferent, and I felt profoundly grateful to be sitting there, free and whole and honest about who I was. I thought about everything that had happened, the discovery that shattered my understanding of my family, the investigation that exposed decades of secrets, the trial that sent my uncle to prison, the relationships that fractured and the new ones that formed. I thought about my grandfather's letter and his hope that I would be better than he was. And I realized I had been given a gift, wrapped in trauma and loss, but a gift nonetheless. I had learned who I was when tested. I had discovered I could stand alone if necessary. I had proven to myself that I valued truth more than comfort, justice more than convenience, integrity more than acceptance. The waiter brought the check and I paid it, leaving a generous tip, and walked out into the warm evening. The city hummed around me with 1,000 stories being lived simultaneously, each person carrying their own secrets and struggles and moments of grace. I was just one story among many, no longer defined by my grandfather's crimes or my family's dysfunction, but by my own choices and my own courage. I had been Derek Mitchell, the grandson of a spy. Now I was just Derek Mitchell, a man who had found documents in an attic and chosen truth over silence. And that was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October, more than 2 years after I had first opened that footlocker in my grandfather's attic. I was at work, helping a patron locate historical records about Oregon's lumber industry, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar Washington, D.C. area code. I excused myself and stepped into the stacks to answer, and Agent Wilson's voice came through with an unusual tension that immediately put me on alert. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to talk. Something's come up that you should know about. Can you come to the field office this afternoon?" The old anxiety spiked through me, that familiar feeling of waiting for the next terrible revelation. "I thought this was over," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The investigation closed. Robert is in prison. What else could there possibly be?" Wilson's pause stretched long enough to make my stomach drop. We've discovered that your grandfather's network was larger than we initially understood. There are elements that remained active even after his death, people who continued operating using the infrastructure he built. And Derek, some of them have become aware of your role in exposing the operation. We have credible intelligence suggesting you may be at risk. The library suddenly felt too exposed, too public, every patron a potential threat. I told Wilson I would be there within the hour and ended the call with hands that had started trembling. Nicole was at work, so I sent her a quick text explaining I needed to meet with the FBI and would call her afterward. Then I drove to the federal building, checking my mirrors obsessively, seeing threats in every car that seemed to follow the same route. Agent Wilson met me in the lobby this time. Rather than making me wait, his expression grim. We went to a different conference room, smaller and more secure, with no windows and a door that locked from the inside. Agent Torres was there as well, along with a man I didn't recognize, older and harder looking, introduced simply as Mitchell from counterintelligence. The lack of a first name told me everything I needed to know about how seriously they were taking this situation. Mitchell from counterintelligence opened a laptop and turned it to face me. On the screen was a photograph of a man in his 50s, European-looking, with cold eyes and a face that seemed designed to be forgettable. This is Gregor Volkov. He's a former Soviet intelligence officer who transitioned to private intelligence work after the Cold War ended. We've confirmed he was one of your grandfather's primary contacts during the last decade of Frank's life. Volkov ran a network that purchased classified information from American sources and brokered it to various clients, state actors and private entities alike. I stared at the face on the screen, trying to understand what this man had to do with me. Where is he now? Mitchell's expression didn't change. 3 days ago, Volkov entered the United States on a Canadian passport under an alias. We've been tracking him since he crossed the border, and his movements suggest he's heading to the Pacific Northwest. We believe he's coming to Portland, and given the timing and his known patterns, we believe his target is you. The words hit me like cold water. Why would he come after me? Frank is dead. Robert is in prison. What could I possibly have that he wants? Agent Torres leaned forward, her voice gentle but direct. It's not about what you have. It's about what you represent. You're the person who exposed the network, who brought federal attention to an operation that had been functioning quietly for decades. People in Volkov's world operate on reputation and discretion. You damaged both. There's also a possibility he believes you have additional documents or information that could compromise other elements of the network we haven't discovered yet. Agent Wilson added, his tone measured but serious, we're implementing protective measures immediately. We're placing you in a secure location until we can locate and apprehend Volkov. We're also putting a detail on Nicole Harper and anyone else in your immediate circle who might be used to get to you. This is a credible threat, Derek. We need you to take it seriously. The surreal quality of the conversation made it hard to process. 2 years after I thought this nightmare had ended, it was pulling me back in, threatening not just my peace of mind but my actual physical safety. How long? I asked. How long will I need to be in protective custody? Mitchell closed the laptop, his expression unreadable. Until we neutralize the threat. Could be days, could be weeks. Volkov is a professional, and professionals don't move quickly. But they also don't give up easily. We'll find him, but we need to keep you safe while we do. They took me from the federal building to a safe house in the suburbs, a nondescript ranch-style home in a neighborhood where every house looked identical, designed for invisibility. 2 agents I had never met before were assigned to stay with me, rotating shifts every 12 hours, their presence a constant reminder that my life was in danger. I was allowed to call Nicole and explain the situation, hearing the fear in her voice as she processed what I was telling her. She wanted to come to the safe house, but the agents refused, explaining that limiting visitors reduced the risk of compromise. The days blurred together in that house. I couldn't work, couldn't maintain my normal routine, couldn't do anything but wait and worry while agents tracked Volkov's movements through the city. They showed me periodic updates, surveillance photos of a man who might be Volkov spotted in downtown Portland, near the library where I worked, in the neighborhood where Nicole and I lived. Each sighting tightened the noose of anxiety around my chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to believe this would end without violence. On the 5th day of protective custody, Agent Wilson arrived at the safe house with news. We've made contact with Volkov through an intermediary. He's willing to meet to discuss what he wants. Mitchell from counterintelligence believes we can use this meeting to apprehend him, but it requires your cooperation. The plan they outlined was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. I would agree to meet Volkov in a public location, wearing a wire, surrounded by undercover agents who would move in once Volkov revealed his intentions. They assured me I would be safe, that they had done operations like this dozens of times, that the risk was minimal. But I saw the tension in Wilson's shoulders, heard the careful way he chose his words, and I knew the risk was anything but minimal. I agreed because refusing felt like choosing to live in fear indefinitely, always looking over my shoulder, always wondering if today would be the day Volkov decided to act. At least this way I had some agency, some ability to participate in ending the threat rather than passively waiting for someone else to resolve it. Nicole argued against it when I called to tell her, her voice rising with panic, but I made her understand that this was the only way forward that didn't involve hiding for the rest of my life. The meeting was set for a coffee shop in the Pearl District, a busy location with good sightlines and multiple exits. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the tiny microphone and transmitter the technical team had fitted me with, hyper-aware of the weight of the equipment against my skin. The undercover agents were already in position, scattered throughout the coffee shop and surrounding area, invisible to casual observation but ready to move at the first sign of trouble. Volkov arrived exactly on time, which somehow made him more frightening. Professionals who respected schedules were professionals who planned carefully, who thought through contingencies, who didn't make mistakes. He ordered coffee at the counter with no apparent concern, then walked directly to my table and sat down across from me. Up close, his eyes were even colder than in the photographs, calculating and empty of empathy. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, his English accented but precise. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know you must be frightened, but I assure you I mean you no harm if you cooperate." His casual tone, as if we were discussing something mundane rather than the threat he represented, made my skin crawl. I kept my voice steady, remembering Agent Wilson's instructions to keep him talking, to draw out information. "What do you want from me?" Volkov sipped his coffee, taking his time. "Your grandfather kept records beyond what you found in his attic. Insurance, he called it. Documentation of every transaction, every contact, every operation he facilitated. I believe he shared the location of these records with you before he died, either explicitly or through clues embedded in materials you inherited. I need you to give me that information." The claim was absurd, based on a completely false assumption, but it revealed Volkov's motivation. He thought I had evidence that could expose him and others in the network Frank had worked with. "I don't have any other records," I said carefully. "Everything I found I turned over to the FBI. There's nothing else." Volkov's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a flash of calculation. "I don't believe you." Frank Mitchell was too careful, too paranoid to leave his fate entirely in the hands of federal agencies. He would have kept leverage and he would have passed it to someone he trusted. You were his favorite grandchild, the one he spent the most time with. The logical choice. I realized then that no amount of denial would convince him, that he had constructed a narrative that made sense to him and would interpret anything I said through that lens. Before I could respond, his hand moved beneath the table, and I saw the edge of a weapon, just a glimpse but enough to make my heart stop. Agent Wilson's voice came through the earpiece I was wearing, calm but urgent. "Stay calm. We're moving in. 60 seconds. Volkov leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry beyond our table. "You have a choice, Mr. Mitchell. Tell me where the records are, or I will hurt people you care about until you do. Your girlfriend Nicole is at her office right now. I know which building, which floor, which desk. I have people watching her. One phone call from me and she becomes leverage instead of a witness. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The threat against Nicole cut through my fear and ignited something else, something harder. I met Volkov's cold eyes and spoke with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. "You're wrong about the records. They don't exist. And you're wrong about me. I'm not someone who can be threatened into lying. Whatever you do, whatever consequences come, I won't give you something that doesn't exist." Volkov's expression flickered with frustration, the first real emotion I had seen from him, and I knew in that moment he was going to escalate. His hand tightened on the weapon beneath the table, and I braced for violence. Then the coffee shop erupted with movement, agents appearing from every direction, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Volkov froze, professional enough to recognize when a situation had turned impossible, and raised his hand slowly away from the weapon. The arrest happened quickly, efficiently, agents securing Volkov and clearing the civilians from the coffee shop with practiced coordination. Agent Wilson appeared at my side, his hand on my shoulder, asking if I was all right. I nodded, not trusting my voice, adrenaline flooding my system now that the immediate danger had passed. They led Volkov away in handcuffs, and I sat there at the table watching my coffee go cold, trying to process what had just happened. The safe house felt different when I returned to it that evening. Less like a prison and more like genuine sanctuary. Agent Torres debriefed me, walking through the conversation with Volkov line by line, and I learned that the threat against Nicole had been verified, that agents had been positioned at her office building as well, ready to intervene if Volkov's people had moved against her. The coordination of the operation had been extraordinary, but it still left me shaken by how close we had come to a much darker outcome. Volkov was charged with attempted extortion, making terroristic threats, and entering the country under a false identity. The weapon he had been carrying added federal firearms charges. Agent Mitchell from counterintelligence told me that Volkov would likely cooperate with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence, providing information about the remnants of Frank Mitchell's network that were still operating. My testimony about the threats he made would be crucial to ensuring he couldn't negotiate his way to freedom. I was released from protective custody 3 days later, after agents had swept my home and Nicole's office for surveillance devices, and confirmed that Volkov's local contacts had either fled or been arrested. Returning to normal life felt impossible at first, every shadow threatening, every stranger potentially dangerous. But Nicole was patient with my hypervigilance, and the therapist I had been seeing helped me process the trauma of being targeted for violence because of choices I had made years earlier. The trial for Volkov happened the following spring, a shorter and less media-saturated affair than Robert's trial had been. I testified about the meeting, about his threats against Nicole, about his false belief that I possessed records that didn't exist. The jury convicted him on all counts, and he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of additional charges being filed as the investigation into the broader network continued. With Volkov's arrest and conviction, the final thread connecting me to my grandfather's criminal enterprise was severed. Agent Wilson called to officially inform me that I was no longer considered at risk, that the network had been sufficiently disrupted that retaliation was unlikely. The relief I felt was profound but complicated, wrapped up in grief for the years this had stolen from me, for the innocence I had lost, for the family relationships that would never be repaired. Nicole and I got married that summer in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard, surrounded by people who loved us without condition or complication. My mother attended, sitting in the back row with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes, but her presence felt like an acknowledgement that some bridges could be partially rebuilt even if they would never be as strong as they once were. Brandon didn't come, and I had stopped expecting him to. Some losses were permanent, and accepting that was its own form of freedom. I thought often about my grandfather's letter, about his instruction to be braver and better than he had been. I had tried to live up to that challenge, had made choices that cost me dearly but that I could defend without shame. The documents I found in his attic had set in motion a series of events that exposed decades of betrayal, brought criminals to justice, and ultimately made me a target for violence. But they had also forced me to define who I was independent of family loyalty, to choose integrity over convenience, to stand alone when standing with others would have required me to compromise my values. The library promoted me to a senior position overseeing their archives and special collections, recognizing my attention to detail and my understanding of how to handle sensitive historical materials. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had become a professional keeper of records, devoted to preserving truth and making it accessible, a direct inversion of my grandfather's life spent hiding truth and trafficking in secrets. I found deep satisfaction in the work, in helping researchers access information, in preserving documents that told honest stories about the past. Years passed, and the sharp edges of trauma gradually softened into something I could carry without it consuming me. I never forgot what my grandfather had done, never minimized the harm his choices had caused, But I learned to hold that knowledge alongside the genuine moments of connection we had shared. Human beings were capable of both tremendous good and terrible evil, sometimes within the same person, sometimes within the same life. Understanding that complexity didn't excuse the evil, but it made the story more complete, more honest. I visited Frank Mitchell's grave one last time on what would have been his 90th birthday, bringing with me a sense of closure I hadn't possessed on previous visits. I told him about Volkov's arrest, about the network being dismantled, about my marriage and my work and the life I had built from the ruins of the one he had left me. I told him I had tried to be braver and better, and that I thought I had succeeded, not perfectly but genuinely. And then I left, knowing I wouldn't return, that this chapter was finally completely finished. The documents that had started everything remained in federal evidence storage, classified materials that would eventually be reviewed for historical declassification but would never be returned to my possession. I didn't need them anymore. Their contents were burned into my memory, but their physical presence no longer had power over me. They were just paper and ink, evidence of crimes committed long ago by people who were dead or imprisoned. They were history, not destiny. What remained was the person I had chosen to become in response to discovering those documents, the values I had demonstrated under pressure, the courage I had found to stand alone when necessary. I had been tested in ways I never anticipated, and I had emerged with my integrity intact, my conscience clear, and a profound understanding of the difference between family loyalty and moral courage. Sometimes those things aligned, but when they didn't, I knew which one I would choose. I had proven it to myself and to the world. The story of Derek Mitchell, grandson of a spy, had become the story of Derek Mitchell, a man who chose truth over comfort and paid the price for that choice without regret. It was a story I could live with, a story I could be proud of, a story that was finally blessedly complete. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.